Clara Bennett was 25, living a quiet life in a mountain town where winters stretched longer than hope and summers passed like fleeting breaths. She spent her days working in the town's dusty old pharmacy and tutored neighborhood kids in the evenings. Life wasn't easy, but it was hers. Until the day everything fell apart. Her father, once a hard-working but fragile mechanic, had drowned in debt after a failed investment. And in his desperation, he made a trade, giving away the only thing he had left of value, his daughter. There was no proposal, no white dress, just a contract inked in silence. 1 year. That was the deal. Clara would live with Damien Vale, a real estate tycoon, a reclusive billionaire whose influence rippled through cities and skylines. In return, her family's debts would disappear. She didn't remember saying yes. She only remembered the weight of her father's trembling shoulders and the salt of his tears. That moment smelled like oil, fear, and goodbye. From that point on, Clara wasn't just a daughter or a girl with quiet dreams. She was collateral, her freedom signed away with a pen she never held. The seaside mansion rose like a painting crafted in silence. Floor-to-ceiling windows caught the restless ocean, and the ivory walls gleamed as if polished by sunlight itself. But to Clara, it wasn't a home. It was a gilded cage. Damien Vale stood at the grand entrance when she arrived, tall, tailored in a charcoal suit, his eyes sharp as glass, cutting through her with quiet precision. He didn't smile, he didn't greet, he only nodded like one would acknowledge a delivery arriving on time. She didn't flinch, didn't let it show. But inside, the cold had already settled. Outside, waves crashed against the rocks, wild, indifferent, echoing the world she'd just stepped into. There weren't many words. An older woman led Clara upstairs, her heels silent on the marble floor. The room she was shown into was beautiful in a way that suffocated, silk-draped, wood-polished, dimly lit with warmth that felt borrowed. Clara stood still, eyes scanning the perfection. The linens, the scent of lavender, the quiet hum of wealth. It was all too pristine, too foreign. This room might as well have been a museum. It wasn't hers. And she knew she didn't belong here. Not yet. The first night arrived without warning, wrapped in silence. Clara was led back to her room, the fire flickering low in the hearth, casting gold against velvet walls. On the bed lay a cream silk nightgown, delicate enough to vanish against her skin. She didn't wear it out of submission, but out of defiance. To refuse it would be to give him the satisfaction of resistance. Everything felt cold, even the softness of the sheets. She sat on the edge of the bed, spine straight, gaze steady, like a warrior waiting for the enemy. The door opened. Damien entered, silent as the ocean beyond. The firelight danced across his face, revealing a faint scar near his temple, the only flaw on an otherwise perfect exterior. He approached, each step deliberate. There was no lust in his eyes, only calculation, curiosity, a test. "You belong to me now," he said, voice low and even, like it was simply fact. Clara lifted her chin. Her heart pounded, but her eyes didn't waver. "You may have bought my body," she replied, voice hoarse but unshaken, "but not my soul." Damien stopped. A flicker perhaps crossed his face, then he smiled, slow and dangerous. "Let's see how long that fire lasts," he murmured, and turned away. He left her with the silk, the shadows, and the silence. She didn't sleep that night, but she knew she'd just lit something in him, something neither of them could put out. The days passed like waves, steady, cold, but never gentle. Damien's seaside estate didn't hum with noise, but it had a rhythm. The hush of staff footsteps, the soft rustle of sea breeze through the halls, the lingering scent of polished wood tinged with salt. Clara stopped resisting and started watching. She learned how to exist in this world, a world where power hid behind crystal, silk, and silence. She wore long silk gowns, dined in a room large enough for an orchestra, and sat across from Damien beneath chandeliers and ruby wine. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. Every glance, every brief question was a move in a silent game. But Clara realized something. Silence was a weapon too, and she could learn to wield it. She began to push back, a direct stare into his eyes, a curt reply that held no submission, a quiet refusal of the diamond necklace he had sent to her room. Damien didn't show anger, but he noticed. He started watching her longer, like she'd stopped being a line item in a contract and become a variable he couldn't quite predict. Inside this house of velvet and dominance, Clara understood the cage wasn't only a prison. It could be a weapon. And she was learning how to fly. Clara had learned how to exist in Damien's world, quiet as velvet, sharp as truth. She hadn't won anything, not truly, but she hadn't surrendered either. Every rejected gift, every direct stare felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Then came the wedding. No flowers, no guests, just a private dinner and a ring slipped onto her hand like a silent brand. Damien didn't say, "I love you." He only said, "Starting tonight, everything belongs to us." The bedroom glowed with candlelight. The scent of jasmine thickened the air, cloying and lush. Clara wore a smoky gray silk nightgown, her skin tingling where the cool fabric touched. She sat on the edge of the bed, composed but burning inside. When Damien entered, he didn't speak. He didn't rush. He approached slowly, giving her space she didn't take. She didn't run. When he touched her, his lips at her neck, hands tracing her arms, it felt like a test. She didn't want to feel, but her body betrayed her. Each breath, each involuntary shiver down her spine told the truth. Her voice would not. "I don't love you," she whispered as he murmured her name against her skin. Her voice cracked with effort. "You know that." Damien didn't stop. He kissed her softer. "I've never asked you to," he breathed. "I just want you to feel." And she did. Every heartbeat, every movement pulled her closer. Her mind tried to stay distant, but her body had already surrendered. Not to love, not to the man, but to something terrifying. Intimacy. That night, Clara didn't cry, didn't scream. She breathed through the quiet, wondering if a soul could stay untouched while the body gave in. And if it couldn't, what then? The morning after, Clara woke to sunlight slipping across silk sheets like a whisper. The scent of jasmine still clung to the pillow, to her hair, to the very air, as if the night before had refused to fade. Damien was gone. No sign of him remained, not on the bed, not in the room, but her body remembered. Her skin still tingled from his touch, and her breath felt like it belonged to someone else. She dressed in silence and wandered to the library, seeking quiet, perhaps even escape. The room smelled of polished wood and forgotten years. It welcomed no one, which was exactly what Clara needed. She scanned the shelves aimlessly, fingers drifting along old spines, until one worn volume gave way in her hand. A letter slipped free from its pages, creased, yellowed, aged. She recognized the handwriting before reading a single word. Her grandfather's, "To Damien Vale," it began. Her chest tightened as she read. A plea. Desperate. Her grandfather, once a hopeful investor, had lost everything in a failed venture. The letter begged Damien for help. Not just any help. Financial salvation. Clara's hands trembled, not from the discovery, but from the implications. Damien hadn't entered her life through her father's debt alone. He had already stood on the edge of her family history years before she ever breathed his name, a ghost at the door, a man in the shadows of their downfall. And now he was in her bed, whispering her name. Her mind reeled. Was this fate, coincidence, or something far more deliberate? Clara held the letter through the afternoon, fingers curled around its brittle paper like it might dissolve if she let go. But she couldn't afford for it to disappear, not yet. In those faded words, she could hear her grandfather's voice, trembling, desperate, still believing in Damien Vale. Damien hadn't answered, and now he was the man who had touched her skin, whispered her name into the dark. She couldn't decide what pulsed louder in her chest, betrayal, rage, or the sudden, searing clarity that nothing between them had ever been coincidence. By nightfall, she could no longer sit still. She didn't hide behind silk or shadows. She walked out to the terrace where the sea wind cut sharp and salt stung the air. Damien was already there, as if he'd known. They stood side by side, the silence louder than any confrontation. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was low, heavy. "You knew my grandfather, you got his letter, so why didn't you ever tell me?" Damien didn't look at her, but his voice came steady, laced with something raw. "I did get it, I read every word, but I was nothing then. A boy clawing out of debt, barely surviving. I couldn't help him. I wasn't strong enough." Clara turned to him, eyes burning. "But you could have told me. I came into this house blind, not knowing you were part of my family's ruin." He turned now, slowly. The weight in his gaze wasn't defensiveness. It was regret. "Because that letter, it's my scar, Clara. I've carried it for years, and you—" He paused, voice barely a breath. "You're the only person who's ever made me want to face it." She tightened her grip on the letter. It felt lighter than truth, but heavier than anything she'd ever held. And for a moment, she didn't look at him with hatred, but with a tenderness born from shared damage. For her grandfather, for herself, and perhaps even for the man standing next to her, bound to her in ways deeper than either of them had wanted. There was no distance between them now, but neither dared to ask, was the fire between them love, or simply the heat of all the things left unsaid? A few days later, Clara accompanied Damien to a prestigious charity gala, a gathering of the city's most powerful names in finance and real estate. She wore a deep sapphire blue silk gown, tiny gemstones stitched into the hem like stars caught in motion. Around her neck was the emerald necklace, his first gift, the one she once refused. But tonight, she wore it. Not for him, for herself. Because tonight, she wasn't hiding. They entered the grand ballroom in silence, but silence couldn't muffle the attention they drew. Damien moved with his usual composed elegance, the room bending to his presence. Clara walked beside him, tall, poised, no longer a shadow behind him, but a force in her own right. For a brief, flickering moment under chandeliers and champagne, she felt powerful. Until the past caught up to her. Dressed in an expensive gray suit, hair silvered with age, voice smooth and sharp. "Clara Bennett," the man said, eyes narrowing on the emeralds at her throat. "Lawrence's granddaughter, aren't you? I invested with him once. And with Damien, back when he was just a no-name broker." The air thinned. Clara turned to Damien, his jaw tensed, eyes darkened. He said nothing. He didn't deny it, didn't explain. The silence screamed louder than words. The man chuckled dryly and walked away, leaving her standing in a room full of gold and whispers. He knew, others knew, and she was just the newest chapter of an old, unfinished story. Clara stepped out of the ballroom as if slipping free from gravity. Laughter, strings, crystal lights, all of it echoed like sound underwater. Damien followed, silent, as if he knew the next move was hers to make. She stopped on the high balcony, the night wind brushing her bare arms, chasing heat from her skin. She didn't turn when she spoke. "You could have told me everything sooner," she said, not angry, just tired. "About my grandfather, the investments, the truth." Damien stood behind her, gray eyes shadowed, unguarded. "I was afraid," he said after a pause. "Afraid if I told you, you wouldn't walk through that door. And I needed you to, even if it started as a deal." Clara turned to face him. The wind tangled her hair, but she didn't care. "So what am I, Damien? A way to fix your guilt? A second chance to rewrite your past?" He didn't answer right away. Then he stepped closer, reaching for her hand, voice low. "You're the only chance I have not to make the same mistake again. You're the most real thing I've ever had." She looked into his eyes. The power was gone. No billionaire, no contracts, just a man, flawed, scarred, open. "I could have walked away," Clara whispered, "many times. But I didn't. And in that truth, she made her choice. Not for debt, not for history, but for love unbound, unspoken. A love that was finally hers to give. They didn't return to the gala. There was no need. Damien walked her to the car, his hand around hers, not as control, but as invitation. As the car pulled away from the hotel, the city lights shimmered behind them. Clara didn't look back. She didn't need the glitter, the whispers, or the stares. The only thing she carried was the choice she had made on that balcony. "I stayed," she had said. And everything had shifted. Damien sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on her knee, not to claim, not to control, just to be present. When they returned to the mansion, Clara didn't wait for the door to be opened for her. She stepped out first, walked in first. Damien followed, not as the man who once led, but as someone willing to walk beside her. They didn't talk about love, or forever, but their movements spoke clearly. Damien went to the kitchen, poured the wine himself. Clara slipped off her heels, her bare feet brushing the cold floor. It felt like shedding roles, shedding armor, like starting over. They sat across from each other by the fire. Shadows danced on the walls. Silence settled like a shared breath. Finally, Damien spoke. "I don't want to control you," he said, "or keep you. I just want to go with you, if you'll let me." Clara looked at him, long and steady. Then she nodded. "I'm not signing any more contracts," she said, her voice steadier now. "But if you're still willing to build something real, with me, not for me, I'll lay the first stone." Damien smiled. No smirk, no arrogance, just warmth. The kind of smile that doesn't conquer, doesn't possess, just stays. A smile that says, finally. Love is something they both chose. Time didn't need much to change everything. Just a nod, a glass of wine raised beside the fire, a quiet promise, "We'll start over." From that simple beginning, something real took root, growing, not loud, not showy, just true. 2 years later, the seaside mansion had changed. The seaside mansion was no longer a gilded cage. Now it echoed with laughter. Tiny footsteps racing down marble halls, sun-drenched mornings filled with the scent of cinnamon rolls from the kitchen, where Damien, surprisingly, had become the kind of father who knew how to braid hair and tell bedtime stories with a straight face. Clara sat in the reading room, barefoot, a mug of tea in her hand. On the plush rug beneath her, their twins sprawled, Aiden with his father's storm-gray eyes and Elena with Clara's soft caramel curls. They giggled over wooden blocks and whispered secrets only siblings could understand. Damien entered, sleeves rolled, holding a tiny milk bottle in one hand and an old book in the other. He still wore the calm that once unsettled boardrooms, but his gaze, when it settled on the children, had softened into something human, something warm. "You know," he said, settling beside her, "I used to think money could rewrite the past." She glanced at him, her smile quiet. "And now?" "Now I know," he murmured, eyes never leaving the children. "The future is the only thing worth building with our own hands." She squeezed his hand, not to anchor herself, not to control, just to hold on. They weren't perfect, but they were home to each other, and in the laughter that spilled through walls once filled with jasmine and silence, they knew love hadn't just saved them. It had created something new.